Welcome to this program from Nelson, British Columbia. I'm Sue Cote, and with me is Bob Inwood, Main Street Heritage Coordinator for the City of Nelson. Over the last few years, the City of Nelson has been involved in restoring many of its fine old buildings. Most of the work is now complete, and we're very pleased to be able to take you on a heritage walking tour of the city's downtown core. We're going to be following the path of the Heritage Walking Tour brochure. This brochure is the result of efforts of the Heritage Advisory Committee and focuses in on some of the interesting and historical architectural information. If you're visiting Nelson, the brochure is available at the Chamber of Commerce. Now let's go out onto the street where we're going to be standing in front of the Nelson Provincial Courthouse. Bob, could you tell us some of the interesting details about this building?
The Nelson Courthouse was built by Francis Mawson Rattenbury, who was the most prominent Victorian architect that BC was able to produce. He's perhaps most noted for his very earliest commission, which was the Parliament buildings in Victoria, British Columbia. He designed this courthouse in the early 1900s, and it was completed in 1906. It exhibits several interesting architectural features, not the least of which is the stone from which it's made, a local Kootenai marble, which was milled from up in the Lardo area, and it exhibits the Richardsonian Romanesque style, which, if we can take a look at the building now, I'll try to point out exactly what creates those features. We're focusing in now on some of the specific features of the building. The term Richardsonian Romanesque is taken from the architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who was a very prominent American architect at the turn of the century, schooled in the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, France. The term Romanesque refers to the round-headed arch over the doorway, and Mr. Richardson used this particular style so prominently that it was actually given his name. And a couple of the features on the courthouse here, which are very typical of this Richardsonian Romanesque style, are the very prominent arch over the main doorway to the courthouse, and also the use of the so-called rusticated building blocks, which were left in a somewhat rustic fashion on the outside of the building.
Bob, the arch is one of the most impressive features of the courthouse. And one of the things that does make it so impressive is the contrast in the textures of the building materials. If our viewers would take a closer look, they will see that the rusticated blocks are very nicely framed by polished marble.
Yes, this is an excellent example of the Victorian designer's use of these contrasting textures. Here we see the segmented blocks leading up to the keystone, which is the secret of the Roman arch.
Bob, another feature of this building that I notice is the little turret on the corner there. Could you give us some information about that turret architecturally?
In addition to the Richardsonian Romanesque elements on this building, the courthouse also exhibits some of the stylistic influences of the Chateauesque style. The Chateauesque style came from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, France. The École stressed the symbolism of architecture, and in this particular instance went back to some of the great river palaces in France from the 1400s to create a castle-like appearance, and we'll see this style exhibited in some of the other buildings around Nelson as well.
Right now, Bob, we're looking at the crest for the City of Nelson. It's placed in the center of the turret for the City Hall, which stands at the corner of Ward and Vernon Streets, kitty corner from the courthouse, which we've just seen. These two government buildings make one of the most impressive street corners in Nelson. Bob, could you tell us a little bit about the style of this building?
This is a fine example of late Victorian architecture, fairly typical of civic buildings. Again, we see quite a mix of architectural styles. We basically in the Chateauesque style, once again, the use of the small European-style dormers and the blending of the local marble on the bottom with a Spokane pink brick on the top.
Could you tell us a little bit about the controversy about this building? I know it was first planned as a post office and customs house.
Well, the controversy came from the fact that the local people were hoping that a building of such large size would, the construction of it would be awarded to local contractors. However, as is somewhat typical of federal buildings, the contracts for both the design and the construction of the building were let to Eastern firms, and the building was pretty well done from out-of-town labor and expertise. So naturally, the local people were a little sorry to see that.
Bob, right now we're focusing in on the dormer. Could you tell us a little bit about the style of this dormer and where it comes from?
These dormers are one of the key indicators of the Chateauesque elements in the City Hall, and they would be taken from medieval European models. You see shapes like this very often in buildings in West Germany and the Netherlands, and it's interesting to note as well that these dormers are placed up against a mansard roof, one of the few in Nelson. Now, panning over to the turret, we see one of the most prominent features of the Victorian architecture, which is the corner turret, here surmounted by a so-called witch's cap made of copper sheeting and surmounted by a dramatic flagpole. The turret was used by Victorian designers to create a monumental appearance to the street corner buildings. We're focusing here on the John Euston Memorial Cenotaph, which was placed in this particular location as at the end of a prominent boulevard by one of Nelson's earliest bylaws, which stated that this particular median should be used only for such prominent architectural features. Again, the cenotaph itself was carved out of local granite, and the light on top is perhaps symbolic of Mayor John Euston's role that he played in establishing the first independent hydroelectric plant here in the Kootenays. And Sue, maybe you could tell us some other stories about Nelson's inglorious mayor.
Bob, John Truth Euston was one of the most interesting characters in Nelson's history. He came here along with many of the other earlier entrepreneurs and started up Nelson's first newspaper, The Miner, in 1890. 2 years later, he started up the Tribune, and Nelson's second newspaper. Euston developed the province's first hydroelectric plant on Cottonwood Creek. Though advanced in his planning for modern conveniences like hydroelectricity, he was a little short on the practical when he decided that a creek would supply enough hydroelectricity for a growing city of 5,000. The Cottonwood Creek plant was fraught with breakdowns and brownouts, particularly during the winter seasons. It became obvious to Euston in February of 1896 that it might be a good idea to unload the Cottonwood Creek plant onto the city. The Nelson City taxpayers objected vigorously to this, but to no avail, and Euston received a very large sum of money for his folly. We're standing in front of the building that now houses the BC Ministry of Mines. When it was built, it was intended to house the land titles and was called the Land Registry Office. Bob, could you tell us a little bit about the building, of what kind of materials they used for this building and why it's special?
Well, this is a nice example of a high Victorian building, and it stretches quite a bit down below, but the facade that we see here is a good example of the eclectic use that they made of very many different styles, and mainly what we're looking at here is a Greek temple form. You can see the Greek classical elements in the symmetry of the building. That is, it's very well balanced on both sides of the central doorway, and the doorway itself then is very much in the Grecian mode, both in terms of the triangular pediment on top and carrying right through into the detailing, such as the little tooth-like dental courses which run down around the ornamental cornice.
I know one of the problems that small frontier towns had was one of fire protection and putting together a fire department. In the early days, Nelson was a little bit careful about this and had a number of bylaws, one of which started the masonry buildings on Baker Street, which we'll be seeing later. This building is of particular interest because of the fire protection features that are built right into the building. Bob, perhaps you could show us a little bit about this building in the far as fire protection is concerned.
Well, one of the main things is the material itself, the brick, which is of course quite fire retardant, and often in buildings like this the walls would have been a good 2 feet thick, which certainly would take any flame a long time to penetrate that. Another thing that's specifically to this building are these fire retardant metal doors, which pretty well assured that all of the paperwork that was stored inside, all the important mining claims, would be safe in the advent of any fire. And there's also a series of metal shutters similar to this door, which draw over all of the windows. So I think the papers were certainly well protected in this building.
We're looking down on the jam factory building. Bob, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about when this building was built and what material was used.
Well, the McDonald Jam Factory building was built in the 1920s, and it's made out of locally quarried granite. It's pretty typical of an industrial style building in that not a particularly great amount of care was taken in the architecture here, yet it still does show some fine stone laying. The building walls are over 2 feet thick, and it's interesting to note that back before Vernon Street, which is in front of the building, was raised, its ground floor level was 2 stories below where it is now. Those areas are now underground, and on the top floor is the entrance down into the restaurant, which is currently inside the building. This building, incidentally, won the first Heritage Building of the Year award for the restoration which was done.
Bob, another interesting thing about this building is that the owner, James Albert McDonald, indicated that jam should be absolutely pure and free of false coloring, glucose, and other cheap substitutes. It sounds very much like what we're trying to promote today, doesn't it, Bob?
Yeah, I guess he was just a visionary there in his own day.
We're standing up on Baker Street right now, and we're looking right straight at the date stone of the Bank of Montreal building. Bob, could you tell me a little bit about the history of this building and some of its features?
Yes, this building was also designed by F.M. Rattenbury, the same architect who designed our Nelson Courthouse. He did quite a few provincial buildings and bank buildings around the province. He was pretty well a house architect for the Bank of Montreal at one point. And this imposing little corner building here is very typical of Mr. Rattenbury's forays into the Beaux Arts classical revival. Looking at some of the detail work on this building, which is constructed of a light brick and terracotta ornament, the terracotta being a very hard, high-fired clay, mostly imported from Italy. He here has used high Victorian styling and motifs taken from the Art Nouveau period, especially in the quite florid swirls at the top of the building. And again, this Beaux Arts revival movement, which relied on very picturesque detailing, which can be seen in the quite striking and dramatic balusters there up in the skyline of the building, makes a very imposing juncture with the sky.
One of the other aspects of this building that was new to construction was the use of I-steel beams instead of wooden joists. As we look down the street, the far building at the end of these 3 buildings on your television screen is the Nelson Daily News building. This is very typical of office block architecture and was constructed in 1899 to 1900. In 1905, it was sold to the Nelson Daily News, and the newspaper is still published in this building. Next door to the Nelson Daily News is the Hamilton Powder Building, identifiable by its darker red brick. I understand this building has special significance for you, Bob.
Yes, the Hamilton Powder Building served for 3 years as the storefront office for the Main Street program. It was from this storefront that most of the downtown revitalization work was coordinated. The building itself is a very fine example of a late Queen Anne style building. And the things that show us this are the strongly detailed brickwork at the top of the building, and also in the arches above the doorway and the symmetrical side windows, the strongly contrasted colors there between the marble arches and the deep red brick to their sides.
As we look down Baker Street, at the end of your picture there, you can see a gray building with a very attractive cornice. Bob, could you tell us a little bit about the Maglio block here?
The Maglio block was built in 1914 and is again a good example of high Victorian architecture. This block was also built of local marble, and you can see some fine detailing in the classical style up above the windows there.
Next door to the Maglio block is the McKillop building, and this building was constructed in 1897 for Alexander McKillop, a mineral assayer and one-time alderman for Nelson. Bob, maybe we could go up to the top of the building and take a closer look at the detailing, the Victorian detailing in the brickwork.
Yes, this building has some particularly fine examples of high Victorian brickwork. One of the things that the architects attempted to do in those times was to use the natural materials in very striking ways by contrasting both colors and textures. And on this building, it's one of the nicest examples in Nelson, dramatically demonstrating the variety of possible configurations of brick placement, such as these arcade corbels and obliquely laid bricks, both creating strong textures. String courses of different materials, such as these granite lintels, draw further attention to the structural elements of the building facade. Another interesting feature on the McKillop building is the use of stamped and pressed metal for architectural detailing. This was quite typical in the high Victorian period, where whole elements of the building could be bought out of catalogs. And in this particular building, the cornice, which runs across the whole front of the building here, is made out of stamped zinc. And even the post systems which support the building are made of cast iron from a foundry down in Spokane.
We're standing in front of two very attractive buildings. They are very good examples of wooden frame buildings, but they're the only ones left on Baker Street. And the reason for this is that in 1897, City Council passed a bylaw that no more wood frame buildings were to be built on Baker Street, and only ones out of masonry were to be built. Bob, I wonder if you could explore with us some of the very special features of these wooden frame buildings.
So as you mentioned, these were the last two wood frame buildings on Baker Street. At one time, as we can see in this old photograph of these buildings from the turn of the century, the street was lined with such structures. However, they were quite susceptible to fire, and this caused many of them to be dismantled or lost to us over the years. These particular buildings, for several years, were covered over with stucco, and we didn't even realize that they were actually made of wood, but in the restoration process that we went through, we found quite a lot of the detailing was still left there. And one of the things we see here is the mansard roof, which again is quite special in Nelson, and the way that these buildings were created to give quite magnificent aspect to the street at relatively low cost to their owners. One of the things to note that's very typical of high Victorian architecture when has been done in wood are the very fancy decorative shingle work that you see across the top of these buildings. Back in the days when labor was cheap, it was nothing for people to be hired for 50 cents a day to stand around and laboriously hand saw out all the intricate patterns and jigsaw work that we see on these wooden buildings. And again, quite a bit of classical detailing, still coming from the Greek and Roman. You see the little Greek pediments over the top of the windows on the building on the left, and the dental courses underneath the cornice, and over on the building on the right in the center, the sunburst motif, which was very popular during the Victorian period. Now on the opposite side of Baker Street, we're looking at the McCulloch building, which was constructed of granite back in 1912. This is a later style of Victorian building. You can see here that they were moving away from the high Victorian style. It's a bit more restrained in its ornament, yet there still is quite a bit of texture and artistry left. The stone here, again, granite, which was locally quarried, And in the cornice there, which runs right over the awning, you notice still the acknowledgement of the Greek detailing. Again, the cornice is made out of stamped metal, and we see brackets supporting the cornice, which are similar to the types of brackets in Greek architecture, and again, the tooth-like dental course, which runs right underneath that. This particular building is technically termed Edwardian, which just places it stylistically in the latter part of the Victorian era.
We're standing in front of the Barnard block, Bob, and this was built in 1897. It was the first branch that the Royal Bank of Canada put into the province of British Columbia. I wonder if we could zip up with our camera and take a look at the bay windows. These are the only bay windows in the remaining in the city's commercial district. Bob, could you tell us a little bit about the style of these windows?
Well, these are bay windows, as you mentioned, Sue, which are very typical of the high Victorian architecture. Back in the old days of Nelson, there would have been quite a lot more of this type of feature posed out over the main street. But here we have the only two that are left. And something else to notice about this building, as I mentioned earlier, in the high Victorian, this use of strongly contrasting colored building materials. We've got the white and the red brick there juxtaposed one against the other in a very dramatic interplay of light and dark. And this all was part of what went together in the high Victorian architecture to make it so colorful.
Carrying on down towards the Bank of Commerce building is the Stirlng Home Furniture building. And this is a Queen Anne building, and it was constructed of locally fired brick and dates back to 1904. And one of the interesting features about this, Bob, that it was a furniture store when it was constructed, but it was also the site of an undertaking business, and it was rumored that coffins were constructed on the premises. Right now, we're looking at the Bank of Commerce building, and this building was built in 1907 of Kootenay marble. And Bob, I noticed that this building is very different from the other fancier buildings along Baker Street here. I wonder why, if you could tell me a little bit about the style of this building.
Well, this building is also in the Beaux Arts Classical Revival style, which was one of the later styles of the Victorian period. And what was happening toward the end of the Victorian period was architecturally they were moving away from the more flamboyant, picturesque, back to the more restrained, classical detailing from the earlier part of the period. And in this particular case, the bank chose symbolically to try to get the idea across of the stability by using a Roman temple facade motif. I guess the idea being that anything as stable as the Roman Empire would be a good place to keep your money. So they utilized locally quarried Lardo marble here, which was all hand cut by local artisans. There was no machines used on this, and created this facade duplication of a Roman temple. Some of the detail work that you can see here, which is very typical once again of the classic, are the very classic Ionic columns, which go up into the two volutes taken from the ram's horn. And again, the use of classical detailing such as the dentils and the keystones in the arches over the doorway.
We're standing almost in front of the Bank of Commerce building, looking directly at Lawrence Hardware Store. And this building was the first three-story building on Baker Street. And it was planned that all three stories would be used as a hardware company. It was built in 1897, and Bob, could you tell us a little bit about the highly decorative brickwork that is on this building?
Yes, this building is probably the best example we have in Nelson of the so-called Italian or Italianate style, and this style was again from the high Victorian period, so that the greatly textured detail that you see on the front of the building is again very typical of the high Victorian. And the things that are specific to the Italian style are the use of the round-headed windows on the upper story and the cornice toward the top of the building, which sticks way out well over 2 feet over the sidewalk. and that particular detail was the hallmark of the Italianate style.
One of the other things that I notice about this building, Bob, is that the false front of the building stands way above the natural roof line. Why is this so accentuated?
Well, that particular detail was emphasized quite a bit on all Victorian architecture. The place where the building met the sky was very important to architects in those days, and they would treat it with great flourish. This building, as is typical of so many of the other ones in Nelson, has in fact lost quite a bit of the detail at the top of the building. I think originally it would have had some ornamental urns over on each end of the building, and oftentimes there was a further ornamental cornice or parapet which would have extended even higher above what we see now. Now we're down at the corner of Baker Street and Ward, the main intersection in town, looking at the KWC block, which was named for its original owners, Kirkpatrick, Wilson, and Clements, who in the year 1901 paid only $10,500 for this major corner bit of real estate. The KWC block is probably the best remaining example of a high Victorian Queen Anne Tower building in the city. At one time, all four corners of this particular block had such imposing buildings, but this is the only one that's left. This building is very typical of the Queen Anne High Victorian, once again through the use of its prominent corner tower, and also the styling and detailing in the brick and granite work that goes around the courses and the top of the building. Again, looking up at the parapet wall, which rises at the very peak, you see what's known as an arcaded corbel, the small rounded arcades of brick which run along the top of the building. And here the architect has used a pleasing blend of the Romanesque style in the round arched windows with a series of dramatic textures throughout the rest of the building's body.
One of the other things that's most interesting about this building is that it was one of the finest grocery stores in Nelson, and it had delicacies from all over the world. We're standing in front of the Burns building, which is also designed by Mr. Rattenbury, and it was built in 1899 for millionaire cattle king Patrick Burns. Now, Bob, I'd like you to take a look at this building and perhaps point out to us some of the Italianate features of this building.
This building is, I think, one of the nicest in Nelson in terms of its architectural detailing. Mr. Rattenbury was famous for the imposing facades that he gave his building, and he certainly spared no expense here. The Italian influences are easily seen specifically in the terracotta work, which was in fact made up specifically in Italy and shipped over to British Columbia. And some of the features here which are typical of the Italianate, once again, is the use of the round-headed window, not only above the main door entrance, but also in all the windows along the upper part of the building. And then you move up through several decorative friezes, which are taken from the Art Nouveau styling, and into the decorative cornices, which show the Greek key pattern, and then into the prominent overhanging cornice supported by ornamental brackets, which is so typical of the Italianate, and finally up into the quite ornate Italian-style urns along the very crest of the building. And these urns are cast from solid concrete, and although they look quite small from down here on the street, are really quite huge and take more than one man to move any one of them.
Another feature of this building is the date stone. If we could focus down onto that date stone, it has the head of a cow. And Mr. Burns was a very promotion-minded person, and one of his advertising gimmicks was to freeze a whole cow and then stand it in the front of the windows of his butcher shop, which horrified a number of the patrons, and he lost a lot of business because of it. We're standing across the street from the Aberdeen block, which was constructed in 1898 by mine manager and hardware store owner George F. Beer, who later became a Nelson alderman. As many of our viewers have probably noticed, we have many buildings in Nelson in the high Victorian style. By the time these buildings were completed, this style had lost its popularity. Bob, maybe you could explain to us why we have so many buildings in this style in Nelson.
Well, Sue, Nelson offers a unique glimpse of how regionalism has affected Canada's architectural history. Most of the trends that influenced building styles across Canada traveled from the east to the west across the country on the heels of the railroad. However, because BC was separated from the east by the Rocky Mountain barrier, much of its architectural influence came from the south, following the opulent boomtown trends of the American gold rush mentality. The incredible wealth of Nelson's Silver Strike economy allowed a grand architecture to develop in the wilderness. It was of a scale and permanence that was far beyond the neighboring communities. By the early 1900s, when Nelson had reached its peak of prosperity and expansion, the flamboyant Victorian style was already considered passé in most parts of the country. But in Nelson, a last surge of this colorful and energetic Victorianism has been crystallized out of time. Once again, a lot of the typical high Victorian detail work, which is most typified by the strongly contrasting colors and the great deal of texture which has been used by the architect in the ornamental brickwork up at the top of the building. This building actually is made of a red brick with architectural concrete detailing combined with more stamped metal work up in the top portions of the building. As we see in this before slide, at some point in its history, the building was painted totally white, which subjugated its architectural detailing. As part of the restoration process, a multicolored scheme was chosen to emphasize its Victorian styling. And then if we move right on over to the immediate right onto the wood Vallance building, although this building isn't actually listed on the Heritage Walking Tour, it is worthy of note for the style that it shows, which is the Mission Revival style. The Mission Revival style is also quite prevalent around Nelson, and it takes its architectural cues from the Spanish mission architecture, which came up from the southwest out of California and was quite popular during the early part of the 1900s, the 1920s. If we move right up to the cornice line here, we can see dramatically how the shapes from the Spanish missions are in evidence. Now, wood Vallance originally was a much more high Victorian style of building, built of brick with the prominent bay windows, but was altered in the later part of the 1920s to its current facade.
So in other words, that date stone of 1904 indicates more that not when it was remodeled. Is that correct, Bob?
That's right. That is the date actually of the original building, and it was then remodeled about 20 to 30 years later.
As we mentioned earlier, Bob, John Houston, the first mayor of Nelson, definitely left his mark on this city, and this is one of the definite marks that is left for our citizens to enjoy today. He commissioned this building in 1899 as a speculative property and then later sold it to a bank. Inside, this building still contains two very large walk-in concrete vaults. Bob, could you tell us a little bit more about the architectural detail and and where the marble comes from?
Well, the marble on this building, Sue, once again comes from the Lardo region, as does pretty well all the marble that's been used in Nelson, and again was hand-fashioned by local craftsmen. This building, the RHC building, was one of the first and most dramatic restoration projects which we've had in Nelson. And if we take a look back here at how the building appeared before the work was done on it, you can see the degree to which its appearance had been altered by some of the stylistic trends of the late 1950s, when it was more in vogue to try to cover over the old architecture than to let it stand forth as it had been originally designed. And on this building, we were able to strip away some of the steel panels which had been placed on it and remove the turquoise blue paint, and did find underneath quite a lot of original detailing left in pretty bad shape. And many local craftsmen labored long and hard to reproduce the damaged detail and to try to restore this building to a semblance of its original magnificence. Well, one of the great surprises that we found on this building was when we stripped the corner away and discovered the beautiful marble carved arch and post which were still in place behind the steel siding. This was quite interesting in that it reopened up the original diagonal entry facade to the building, which was typical of quite a few of the buildings around town, which had been modernized into a squarer mode.
We're standing across the street from the Eagle Block, which was built in 1909 and commissioned for the Fraternal Order of the Eagles. The Nelsonary was the 22nd to be formed in North America and the 4th in Canada. This building is built of brick and trimmed with local granite, and it has had quite a bit of restoration by the Main Street program. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the building and its restoration, Bob.
Yes, well, the Eagles Block was another building which, for mainly structural reasons, had to be altered quite substantially. It was back in the late 1960s that some problems with the large bay window in the center of the upper story of the building seemed to be getting water into it, and there was some fear that it might collapse. So it was removed and the building was cased out in accordance with the style of the times with rather featureless white metal. Some of the members of the Fraternal Order of Eagles, however, had old photographs of the building, and they brought those into the Main Street office, and we managed to get rather excited about the concept of restoring the facade to the way it looked originally. And after working up the sketches and working drawings for it, we were able to strip the metal off and see what was still in place behind the metal facade, and then to recreate the elements which had been totally removed. And here, after adding a canopy over the lower portion of the building, we have the Eagles Block back pretty well to the way it would have appeared when it was originally built, and certainly a great pride to the local Eagles Erie.
One of the other interesting things about this building is that on the street level, there was one of the finest dry goods and ladywear stores in the province of British Columbia. And Mr. Maher, who was the owner, said in a very pompous voice, "The only sale I'll ever have, ladies, is my closeout sale." And that's exactly what he did.
We're turning now up Hall Street, coming into the last leg of the Heritage Walking Tour, and we see here a large granite building which was originally the city garage housing the city buses. This is a good example of the later style of Victorian stonework, more utilitarian, where not a great deal of detail has been placed onto ornamenting the building. It's essentially just large blocks of granite which have been randomly coursed.
Just up from the city garage is a similar building in uncourse granite. The oldest part of this building is the furthest from Josephine Street, the street that's going across just in front of us here. And it's the first stone building constructed in Nelson. And next to that is the lockup, which was an addition made in 1902 and served also as a storeroom and office for the Superintendent of Electric Light. In 1907, this became the center of the electrical distribution for the streetcar system and for businesses and residents. The addition directly on Josephine Street was built in 1934 when the second power line was added from the Kootenay River substation. We're standing in front of the Kerr building, and this is the first apartment building built in Nelson. And Bob, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the construction of this building.
Well, the Kerr apartment block is the most pure example of the Richardsonian Romanesque. We've used that term quite a bit around town. Most of the buildings that we've seen, specifically Mr. Rattenbury's, which exhibit features of that style, are a little fancier than what Richardson himself intended, and that's where this building becomes a very pure example of his style of work. Essentially, Henry Richardson was moving toward the more modern styles of architecture. And what he attempted to do was to eliminate the extraneous surface detail and focus more on the actual concept and the use of the building, that the outside of the building should begin to reflect the function of the inside. So we see here, once again, Mr. Richardson's very powerful use of the Romanesque arch right above us on the central doorway, as well as in the windows up above us, and his use of the massive blocks of rusticated granite with very little surface detailing, just allowing the power of the stone to stand forth here and make its own statement.
This building still functions as an apartment house, but when it was opened in 1911, it had the most modern conveniences of electric light and gas heat and steam, gas for the furnaces and steam heat. And it had anywhere from 2 to 7 rooms in in various apartments.
Yeah, the inside of this building is also very well restored and worth taking a look into if you're walking by. So this pretty well concludes our walking tour of downtown Nelson, and I'd like to say that although we focused in on a few very special buildings, certainly the entire city is full of very impressive heritage architecture, both in the commercial and the residential areas. And we hope that people will get out there now and take a look at some of the beautiful buildings that the city of Nelson has to offer.
Thank you very much for joining us.